fungicides specifically. And fungicides, when we think about fungicides and how they work within the plant, our main goal is to protect the plant's photosynthetic capacity. So that's the whole goal behind a fungicide, is to protect that photosynthetic capacity to try to increase yield. Now, one thing that I thought was really interesting, this is a demonstration that one of my counterparts or former counterparts, Darren Roberts, did out in the answer plots a couple years ago. It turns out I thought he just had way too much time on his hands and was pulling all these leaves off himself. Turns out he just had his kids help him do it, which is kind of nice and a good idea for when my daughter gets a little bit older. But this is a really good demonstration to show what parts of those plants we need to be focused on protecting in order to make sure that we're getting the best chance of seeing the highest return on investment for a fungicide application. And really, when it comes down to it, guys, those top leaves from the ear leaf on up, those are the most critical to protect in order to fill that grain. Now, having said that, coverage is still really important throughout the rest of the canopy, because most of our diseases are starting down in the lower parts of that canopy, and then they move up from there. Okay, but when it comes to yield, the most important leaves are from the ear leaf on up, and this really shows that really well. When we didn't remove any leaves, we on that particular field using hand yield estimates, or that particular demonstration, we ended at 218 bushels per acre. When we removed the bottom leaves, so right down in here, right over here, when we removed those bottom leaves, we averaged about 217. So really not a huge effect on yield. Okay, but it's when we remove the top leaves that we really saw a significant decline in yield. And the reason why is because, again, those top leaves from the ear leaf on up, that's what does a majority of the photosynthetic capacity of that plant. That's what's doing a majority of the work. Now, clearly, the plant has the opportunity to compensate somewhat. For example, you see that when we remove the bottom or the top leaves there, we were at 159. However, when we only left the ear leaf, now all of a sudden we're back at 83 bushels. So the plant can use those lower leaves, but they're not nearly as efficient as some of the from the ear leaf on up in filling that grain. Okay, so that's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to protect that grain filling capacity of those upper leaves. Now, when it comes to diseases, many of you guys have seen this before. It all depends on the environment, the pathogen, and the host. Okay, so when you start looking at it, all three of these have to interact to determine how much of that disease you're actually going to get. Okay, so for example, let's take tar spot. Okay, so if we have soybeans out in the field, we don't have a susceptible host, so we're not going to see any disease of tar spot specifically on those soybeans, right? Whereas if we plant corn, we clearly have a susceptible host. Now, some of this can be within the crop as well, because you can have, for example, corn, which is susceptible to tar spot, but you could have certain hybrids that are maybe a little bit more resilient against tar spot than others. So that susceptible host is an important factor. Next, you got to have the pathogen, right? You got to have whatever fungus or bacteria is actually causing the disease. And the final one that usually drives whether or not we're going to see a problem with fungal diseases is having a favorable environment. And for the most part, when we're talking fungal diseases in particular, that favorable environment is absolutely critical. Generally, we need leaf wetness. And notice I said leaf wetness. I did not say rain, because even though we didn't have much rain in some areas this year, we still got some fungal diseases. It's more about that time of leaf wetness. And so if you're getting those heavy dews in the morning and you go out at 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, you walk across the grass and your shoes are still sopping wet. That's a pretty good environment for diseases to develop. And so it's those three things, along with time, that determines how much of that disease spreads through that field. Okay. Now, when we're talking about fungicides, we do need to learn some of the terminology that you might hear with fungicide applications. First one, I'm going to throw this one out here because we do hear some about this. Fungicides are not real mobile in the plant, but a lot of them will move translamerally. And what that means is that it's basically moving from the top of the leaf to the bottom of the leaf. Okay, now why is that important? Well, in general, a lot of our fungal pathogens will actually infect through the bottom of the leaf. Some won't, some will, just depends on the disease there. But with a majority of fungicides, they do have translaminar movement, so they will move from where we spray it on the top of the leaf to the bottom of the leaf. Outside of that, there's not many of our fungicides that move very far in the plant. And so really when you start to talk about fungicides and making good fungicide applications, it's all about coverage. And that's the whole reason, by the way, why we focus so much on Master Lock with that fungicide and pairing that up, is because of the fact that we don't get very good movement. And so therefore we need very good overall fungicide coverage in order to get effective control. Now, we're not going to spend time going through Master Lock today. That's actually a future session here. But it is important to note that in any fungicide application, you need to have a drift and deposition aid in there along with a surfactant. So you need to have Master Lock in the tank to help penetrate through that canopy and get really good coverage. And in our data, it's actually shown to be about 5.7 bushel advantage over fungicide alone, just because we're getting better overall coverage. Other terms that we need to know, preventative versus curative. Okay, preventative basically means that it's only going to protect if the fungal pathogen has not infected the leaf. Now, some people get a little bit confused with this. Understand that once the lesion is showing, that fungal pathogen has been there for a while. Okay, we usually call this the latency period. Okay, the latency period is the period of time from the point of infection until we can physically see the lesion on the leaf surface. Okay, and so that latency period, although we can't physically see the fungus, it has already infected. And so fungicides that have more of a preventative type of action on that fungal pathogen will not be able to rid the plant of a fungus that has already infected the plant, but maybe hasn't necessarily shown up on the plant yet as a physical lesion. Okay, so think of things like strobilurins, for example, would be ones that have a preventative type approach to fungicide protection, doesn't necessarily provide any control once the fungus has infected. Curative, on the other hand, has an activity once the fungus actually is already infected in the plant. It can kill that post-infection. Now, important distinction to make here. Once the infection has taken place and the lesion has already shown up on the plant, there's really no way of removing that lesion. That lesion's going to be there. What the curative does is it just prevents and kills the fungus that's in that latency period that's already infected, but hasn't necessarily shown a lesion. Okay, this is often known as reach back effect. And a great example of categories in this would be like our triazole type fungicides have very good curative type action. They have some preventative action as well, but have really good curative action. And then SDHI inhibitors also have some pretty good curative action as well. So commonly used fungicides, there's basically three main groups that we see in this category. We have our strobilurins, our triazoles, and our SDHI inhibitors. For the most part, most of our fungicides fit in these three categories. Strobilurins, group 11s, they are protective only. There's really no curative. And so once that disease is in the plant, that's it. Okay, but they have long residual and they have very good protection before that fungus has infected the leaf. Okay, triazoles are a little bit more short-lived. They tend to break down a little bit quicker, but they do have curative type actions. Now, I will say there are some exceptions to that shorter residual rule there. There are certain fungicide classifications. For example, the Revysol molecule in Veltima does have a little bit longer residual than what we're saying in here. They've figured out a way to get it to last a little bit longer in that plant. But in general, some of these other ones do tend to be a little bit shorter lived. And then the SDHI inhibitors tend to have both curative and protective as well. And they also tend to have a little bit longer residual as well. And you can see some of the examples in that category. We'll spend some time going through each one of those categories here a little bit later on in the training. Really, when it comes down to it, guys, fungicides, although the yield component is really important, it's more than just about the yield benefit there. We also have stock integrity type of protection as well, and some other benefits from the fungicide as well. It really comes down to these three benefits: increasing plant growth and efficiency, disease control, and then increase in stress tolerance. The reason I bring this up is because even in a drier, hotter year, we still see a benefit from fungicidal activity. And we're starting to see that as we start to see some of this fungicide data coming out from the answer plots. Even though it was a very hot and very dry season, we still saw benefits from fungicides. The reason why is because it's more than just disease control that's offered by that fungicide. Okay, now one thing I will point out, though, is that not every hybrid responds similarly to fungicidal activity, right? And so one of the things that Winfield United's really focused on was identifying which hybrids respond better to fungicidal activity than others. And we saw in this past year that distinction was really, really important, because we didn't necessarily have high disease pressure in a lot of areas to cause the yield increase from protecting us from the fungus. It was more based on just overall plant health. One thing I will tell you as well is we do see a pretty significant difference in some of the newer fungicides on the market as compared to some of the legacy or mid-tier or generic type fungicides. These premium type fungicides are outperforming some of the lower tier fungicides, specifically in length of residual control. And when you start looking at things like tar spot, northern corn leaf blight, and some of those things, the length of control is critical to getting more and more activity out of those fungicides there. Okay. One thing that I thought was interesting was looking at some of this data. So this is a little bit older data, 2019, 2018 type data here, but it still is valuable data when we come and start looking at disease pressure and incidence versus how each one of these fungicides perform. So, for example, even in a low disease incidence year, you can still see that we got a significant yield increase from these fungicides. Now, this is using more of a this is actually an average of all the different hybrids that we're using here. But in this case, we still saw an advantage even in these low disease instances. Now, didn't see a huge brand ladder distinction, and that makes sense, right? Because again, it's probably not the benefit in this case from the actual fungicide activity on a fungus. In this case, it's probably more of a plant health benefit than anything. And so didn't see that segregation. Where we really started to see that segregation is when we got into that moderate disease type incidence and then the high disease incidence. That's where we started to see this brand ladder start to really break out. And you really start to see that these newer type fungicides are outperforming some of their older counterparts in the mid-tier and the generic fungicides. Not saying that mid-tier is a horrible place to be, but if you're looking for length of residual and consistency in results, that premium fungicide is going to provide us the best benefit, basically, out of all of those. Okay. Another question I often get asked as well, especially around fungicides, is around application timing. There's been a push to go earlier and earlier. And one thing, and I'll throw this data set out here. Now, I just included 1 year's worth of data. I'll tell you about the next year's data, but when you start to look at fungicide timing, guys, the most consistent timing for corn is right at about tassel, okay, or just slightly ahead of tassel. Now, why would that be? Well, the whole reason we see more consistent results right around tassels is remember what we opened up with. Fungicides are not very mobile in the plant. And when we start looking at what leaves we need to protect to get the highest yield potential, it's that ear leaf on up. Okay, the most consistent timing for fungicide applications is right ahead of tassel because of the fact that that's when a majority of our yield affecting leaves are physically present that we can actually hit with that fungicide application. And so that's the whole reason we see more consistent results at that time. Now, we've done a lot of studies out in the answer plots looking at timing of fungicides, and I will tell you that varies. Okay, and I'll show you some data on that for a little bit, or in a little bit here. But this is one of our preliminary studies looking at timing. Now, this is 2019 data, and you can see there was a difference between the V10 fungicides versus the R1 fungicide. It was about 1.4 bushel difference between the R1 and V10. Now, you might ask me, well, Tyler, that doesn't seem like a whole lot. And you'd be correct. I will tell you, though, in that next year, in 2020, where we had a little bit more significant disease incidence, we started to see a little bit more separation between these. Okay. And so what I've started to focus more on, if you have people that are wanting to push that fungicide application earlier and earlier, is I started to look at which of these fungicides, which one of these hybrids specifically responds better at V10 versus R1. So I'll show you some of that data in a little bit here. I had a question, when you tested without Master Lock, was there any other adjuvant used? No. In this case, that other chart here, the difference between the two here was having Master Lock with a fungicide versus no adjuvant in that case. So that's the main difference there. And so you can see that Master Lock does improve the amount of coverage that we get. And in this case, in this year, it was about 4.7 bushels. We do have data over a 5-year period that shows about a 5.7 bushel increase having the Master Lock with the fungicide versus not. And if you're going to spend the money to put that fungicide out there, I highly recommend getting the most efficacy out of that fungicide that you possibly can. And in our data, it was 4.7 bushels. Now, what's interesting about this set of data is this was all done with our the use of our Skywalkers at 20 gallons per acre. So I've had some farmers ask me, well, Gal, Tyler, I'm going to go out at V10, V12, as late as I can to still get across this with my commercial applicator rig, or maybe even my farmer application rig here. And I'm going to use 20 gallons per acre. Theoretically, I shouldn't need Master Lock in that case, right? And the answer is not real, or you still need that. You still need that Master Lock in the tank, because all of this data was done at 20 gallons per acre. Okay. Remember, it's about canopy deposition, but it's also about maintaining that droplet size. If you remember back to when we were talking about herbicides, remember these really, really fine droplets. Once that droplet dries, and I don't care if it's on the leaf or in the air, if that droplet dries, you're not going to get that fungicide into that plant. And so part of what Master Lock does is it keeps that droplet in a more consistent range, keeps those driftable fines down so that we don't get all of that evaporation. One of the worst things that we can do, and it's honestly, it's one of the most common things that I see done out when we're talking about fungicide applications, is they jack up the pressure to try to push that droplet down into the canopy. And theoretically, in your mind, you think, well, yeah, I'm blowing more out, going at a higher pressure, I should be getting better coverage. But realistically, guys, that's actually one of the worst things that you can do, because all you're doing is increasing driftable fines. And when you do that, what we end up doing is we end up actually decreasing the amount of effective fungicide activity that we get, because we're decreasing the total amount of active ingredient that's able to be absorbed through the plant. That's why Master Lock is so critical, is it helps to maintain that droplet, and then having that surfactant helps spread that droplet out on that leaf surface and keeps that droplet wetter longer so that I get more into that plant. So great question. Now, as results, when we start looking at V10, one of the things that this 2019 study led to in the answer plots was we started to dig into, okay, is there a difference in how each one of these hybrids responds to each one of the timings as well? And so one of the things Andy did for me, and I really appreciate him doing this, is he went through and took some of our more recent data here, because starting in 2020, going through 2022 and 23, we started to look at how does each one of these hybrids respond to a V10 application versus a VT application. And what we found is there are actually certain hybrids that respond very well to that V10 application. Now, another thing that we found was really interesting is when you start looking at different rates of nitrogen, it also affects our response to fungicides as well. And I know this is starting to get very complex, but realistically, guys, if you want to add value to a farmer and you want to help them better place each one of these inputs, learn and identify which of these hybrids respond best to fungicides and which ones don't. Because if you can better place your hybrids and your fungicide applications better than any of your competition, you will have a leg up when it comes to both seed selling and getting that fungicide application as well. So when we started to look at it, moderate nitrogen versus high nitrogen, these are the hybrids that responded better at the V10 or equal to at the V10 application with a fungicide versus the VT. Okay, and one of the reasons that Andy put this list together was because, and we haven't had it for a number of years, but when we get a high disease incidence year, who knows, it could be this next year with some of these weather patterns start and shift. Once we get back into a wetter pattern, guys, especially with tar spot, there will not be enough airplanes that can fly all of these fungicides on in a timely fashion. So in that case, we need to have some of these applications go out early. And what better way to help prepare your farmers than to have this list and to go through, okay, this is a hybrid that responds very well to these earlier applications. Let's get it on the list. Let's get it sprayed before all of your surrounding farmers are getting out there doing first pass on these fungicides, because then the planes get backed up and we don't get that fungicide made at a good time. And, just because it's a V10 application here, guys, doesn't mean it has to be on right at V10. I'm just saying these are the ones that respond as early as V10, but realistically, you can go from V10 all the way to tassel. These are just the ones that I would start on when I'm making that fungicide pass and getting out there and getting this taken care of. So this is the cropland hybrids. Here's DeKalb, here's Vermont, here's NK, and here's Pioneer. One of the things I know that Andy's been really focusing on is this set of data. And I know, guys, this kind of data takes some time to understand and to wrap your mind around. But if you can help your farmers better place this fungicide application, the nitrogen, and the hybrid that you're utilizing, you will be miles ahead of people that are just out there selling them seed. Okay, if you're not focused on all the other aspects that go into this agronomic recommendation, we're already behind the 8 ball. Anybody can go out there and sell them seed. Okay, but if you can make that total agronomic package and go out there and make that recommendation based on data, you, first of all, help that farmer make the best decision they possibly can, but more importantly, you are seen as the expert to that farmer, and that farmer will come back to you when they need additional recommendations. Okay, so just to give you kind of a few examples here, this is 5497. You can see that based on this data, the R1 application for a fungicide, whether it be in the moderate nitrogen or the high nitrogen environments, are going to result in the highest response, right? So in this case, that V10 application may not be the application that we want to go with, right? Whereas if we look at like a 5335, if we're more in that moderate nitrogen application, which I personally would argue a lot of our farmers within the states of Iowa and Missouri are in more of this moderate nitrogen application realm. Some of them not, obviously, but a lot of them are. You'll actually see at that V10 timing, we had a little bit better response than what we did at the R1. Okay, whereas when we got into the high nitrogen, then it was better to go at that R1 application. Okay, and then here's a experimental number. You can see a difference there in when we go from V10 to R1 in the moderate nitrogen and the high nitrogen. In this case, the V10 application was slightly better, if not even, basically, to that R1 application. So this is a hybrid specifically that I would probably focus on being in that category, okay, where you can go early with that fungicide. Had another good question about how many pounds of N do you consider moderate versus high? When you start to look at it, that high nitrogen is going to be in that 1.1 to 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, whereas the more moderate, you're looking at like 0.8 to 0.9, somewhere in there. Okay, one of the things, and that's a great question. One of the things, guys, that we've done with our answer plots, it used to be in the past that we'd have one consistent nitrogen rate across the entire, basically, United States, or at least region. that kind of did us a disservice because we had some plots that easily were reaching 300 bushels. Other plots would top out about 190. Okay, so how do you make a nitrogen recommendation from one to the other? And so what we've started to do is going based on historical yields and using that high nitrogen is in that 1.1 to 1.2 range. Moderates more in that 0.8 to 0.9 pounds per bushel. And the reason I argue that we're more in that, a lot of times more in that moderate range, is because a lot of our farmers do tend to use that more 0.8 to 0.9 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of grain. Okay. Now, we focused a lot on corn and making fungicide applications on corn, but we do have pretty decent results out of the answer plots on beans as well. So here's just some examples of fungicide applications on beans and increasing yield with these. You can see here, even in the low disease environment, we were at 2.46 bushels per acre versus the medium disease environments, we were more at that 3.36. In this particular year, we didn't get anything classified as a high disease environment. And so, you know, we focus a lot on fungicide applications of corn, but honestly, fungicides are probably one of the more consistent soybeans are one of the more consistent responders to fungicides when it comes to actual response to that fungicide. One thing I will point out, you know, we did try to test differences in varieties, much like we do with corn, response to fungicide in soybeans as well, and didn't see a lot of difference between the different varieties. It might be something that we need to relook at, especially with all the different trait platforms that we have. But realistically, they were all about consistent. There wasn't a lot of difference in the response. Okay, now this is going to vary a lot based on the year as well. Okay, so areas that I would expect to see the highest response to fungicide on beans is going to be in a cooler, wetter year, obviously. Longer season varieties and varieties that are and years that we have very high stress loads as well. That's where I expect to see the highest potential to see responses to fungicides on soybeans. Okay, so now I'm going to transition talk specifically about fungicide groups. And one of the things you're going to start to notice, and between this week's discussion and then 2 weeks from now when we go into seed treatments, is there's actually quite a bit of overlap between seed treatments and between some of our foliar fungicide applications as well. Okay, so the first group that we're going to discuss is triazoles, and you'll start to see some common components that are coming together here. So for example, like the propiconazole is in a lot of the Syngenta fungicides, for example. You can see Miravis Neo, Trivapro, Quilt Excel, prothioconazole in a lot of in a lot of the Bayer type portfolios, metconazole and this Revysol molecule are in a lot of the BASF type fungicides, and then the cyperconazoles in a lot of the Corteva type fungicides. So you can really start to see some commonality here between them. Really, when it comes down to it, guys, triazoles are a curative type fungicide. They tend not to last nearly as long as more of our like strobilurin type fungicides, but they do have very good activity on fungicides or fungal pathogens. What they do is they actually inhibit the production of sterols in the fungal pathogen. Now, you might ask, well, what the heck's a sterol? What a sterol is it's actually a molecule that's in the cell membrane of that fungal pathogen, that if that's not there, basically the fungal pathogen cells start to leak and create cell death at that point. So by eliminating these sterile production, we end up just basically developing a bunch of holes in the plant. So think of it like basically shooting the cell membrane, putting a bunch of holes in it. That's exactly what it is. So if you can think of sterile biosynthesis inhibitors, the triazoles like a shotgun, that's basically what you're doing to the fungicide. You're just putting a bunch of holes in, or fungus. That's what you're doing. You're putting a bunch of holes in that fungal pathogen. As far as adjuvant recommendations for any one of the fungicides, and you'll see this consistent all the way through, we are going to recommend Master Lock in every single one of these applications. That's where you're going to see the best return is by having that Master Lock in the tank. Okay, group 7s, this is one of the newer fungicide classifications on the market. It's very broad spectrum. The SDHI inhibitors, we're starting to see more and more of them come out. They tend to be longer lasting than for sure than the triazoles, probably equal to, if not a little bit better than the strobilurins. They tend to work on quite a few different diseases as well. So very good category here. And we do start to see some good fungicides in there as well. So you can see we got some of these that are overlapping as well. So one of these that I'll show you is overlapping into the seed treatment realm. For example, we got flupirum, which is in Dolaro Complete. It's basically the complete part of that Dolaro Complete. Flupirum is the same active ingredient that's in, for example, Olivo. So there's the seed treatment. The same is true with pitiflumethafen. That one is the same active ingredient as in Saltra. So you can see where there's some overlap there in some of the seed treatment realm as well. SDHI inhibitors work a little bit different than the triazoles. They actually work a little bit closer to what the strobilurins do as compared to what the triazoles do. But basically what they're doing is they're binding to a part of the fungus that is going through and allowing the plant or that fungus to respire. Okay, so basically what happens is it shuts down this part of that electron transport chain. And you might remember back to when we were talking about herbicides and shutting down the electron transport chain. When you shut down the electron transport chain, it creates free radicals, which destroys the cell. And that's where you get that cell death there. Okay, with the SDHI inhibitors, we're going to recommend Master Lock with those as well. The final group is our strobilurins. You can see there's quite a few different fungicides that have strobilurins in them. But this is the main category of fungus and probably one of the older fungicide categories that we have on the market as well. It works in very similar ways to what the SDHI inhibitor does, but it binds to a different spot. Okay. Now, one thing that makes the strobilurins very unique, and the reason you see it in so many of these different premixes, is because strobilurins have a unique ability to slow down not only the respiration of the fungal pathogen, which, by the way, is what kills the fungal pathogen, it also affects the respiration of the plant as well. Now, you might ask, well, why is that important? Well, the reason why is because when you take a look at photosynthesis and you start taking a look at plants do respire. Okay. Now, a lot of us assume that, you know, the plant's always taking in CO2 and releasing oxygen, but it actually can go the other way as well. Because in order for a plant to successfully use sugars, it actually has to break down the sugars as well. And it goes through a respiration. This generally happens more at night than it does during the day. And specifically, if we get very, very hot nights, we tend to see a lot of plant respiration. Well, anytime we have a plant respiring, we're losing energy. And so one of the key differences with some of these strobilurins is they will lower the respiration rate of that plant as well, which increases yield even in the absence of disease. And we've seen this time and time again out in the answer plots. And I'm pretty convinced that the plant health benefit is actually coming or more subjected to the hybrid type than it is the disease itself. The reason I say that is because a lot of times, even in our low disease type environments, we still see a significant difference in the response based on the hybrid that's out there as compared to others. When we start getting in those high response type environments, it doesn't tend to matter much. A fungicide will improve the yield across almost all of the hybrids out there. Where it really starts to make a difference in the response to fungicide of a hybrid is once you start getting into more of these moderate to low disease type environments. That's where we start to see some significant differences in hybrids. And so that's really what I'm looking at with this group 11. By the way, the best time to see this plant health benefit and where you really start to see that respiration rate pick up is right at tassel time, when we're going through that pollination period. If I can lower the respiration rate during pollination, I can significantly increase yield. One of the things I will caution you as a warning is that we are starting to see some resistance to certain fungal pathogens to strobilurin type chemistries. And mainly it's because of the fact that strobilurins have been out on the market for such a long time, and they've been a very widely used fungus. But you can see all of the different diseases within the US that has shown resistance to strobilurins. One of the biggest ones that affects us here in the states of Iowa and Missouri is frog eye leaf spot. When you start seeing frog eye leaf spot, which haven't seen significant quantities of them in the past, maybe down more in Missouri there, but haven't seen that in significant quantities over the past couple years. But when we start to see this one again, frog eye leaf spot has shown significant resistance to strobilurins, strobilurin type chemistries. So do not rely on strobilurin type chemistries to control frog eye leaf spot. What's really interesting, if you look at some of the work Darren Mueller has done over at Iowa State University in evaluating frog eye leaf spot, in every single instance that they found frog eye leaf spot in the state of Iowa, it was resistant to strobilurin type chemistries. So it's one of those things that we really have to keep in mind as we start making fungicide applications, especially on beans, is that we need to have a good fungicide that has multiple modes of action to control that fungus. Okay, strobilurins do affect this pathway in a different spot than the SDHI inhibitors. So, of course, you guys remember from the previous slide that we were binding right at about this spot here for the SDHI inhibitors. The strobilurins now are right in here, and where that becomes important then is because of that plant health benefit. Okay, so here's our adjuvant recommendation. Not really a surprise to any of you there. Okay, the last about 10 minutes that we're going to spend here, I do want to talk a little bit about tar spot, specifically because even though we haven't had significant pressure across the two states that I cover here the past couple of years, could see that going differently in the next couple of years. Okay, so tar spot, many of you guys know the history of it. I included these just for more of your reference here, we're still learning a lot about tar spot, but I think we have enough knowledge about it that we have a pretty good understanding of how to control this. The biggest thing that I would say I'd watch out for is that we need to pay attention and be monitoring for tar spot because this disease is so aggressive. Okay, it has a longer latency period, which many of you guys remember from our earlier discussions here. Latency period, again, is that time from when the fungus actually infects the leaf surface until we see the disease, the actual lesion on the leaf surface. It does have a longer latency period of that 10 to 14 days. And so once you start seeing signs like this, where you got those really, really small diseases starting, it can spread very, very quickly. So we need to stay on top of things. I always joke at the answer plots, if you really want to identify tar spot, you start seeing little black spots on the leaf, just go and lick them, right? Because if you lick them and they come off, that's not tar spot. That's probably bug crap or something like that. But if it doesn't come off, you might have tar spot. Turn over that leaf and see if you can identify the lesion on the bottom half of the leaf as well. That will truly help you identify whether you have tar spot or not, because tar spot will go clear through the leaf. But the biggest concern that I have is how quickly this can spread, especially under the right environmental conditions. This is kind of a interesting look at the disease and how things are driven based on environment. You can see everywhere that pivot touched is completely dead. You would assume that it would be the exact opposite, right? Because adding more moisture should help with the yield. But in this case, that extra water and the extra moisture kept that leaf wet long enough that we saw that disease develop very, very quickly in that environment. Okay, so it's something that we definitely want to keep an eye on. If you're going out about 9-10 o'clock in the morning and we still have dew on the leaves for about 8 consecutive days, you're probably going to get significant tar spot pressure. So definitely something to keep an eye on there. This is provided to me by Mitch Larson. Appreciate him taking some of these pictures of some of the demos that we've done out in the answer plots here. This was at Jessup, which Jessup tends to be our lead area that we see a lot of tar spot in our answer plots here. That northeast corner of the state specifically has been hit hard. Jessup's probably the closest that I have to pretty significant, between that and Rudd, pretty significant tar spot pressure. But you can see timing of that application is critical. If we have significant tar spot pressure, we need to get out ahead of it. Now, you can be on too early. So for example, here, our first ones are untreated. Take a look at that second picture there in the top one there, the protogam at V5. You'll notice the protogam at V5 doesn't look a whole lot better than our untreated check, right? Well, why would that be? Well, it's probably because we were on too early, right? And so we started to, it might look a little bit greener, but it's not significantly greener. Whereas when you add in that next picture, that tassel application, now it starts to look a lot better. Oh, and by the way, compare that to that V10 application. That V10 compared to VT looks pretty good, right? Now, why would that be? Well, because we were able to get it right ahead of that disease pressure coming in. Okay. That next picture is probably the best of all of them. It's that V10 followed by the VT. We got very, very good results with that. And then you can see Veltima at VT looked pretty decent. V10 kind of looked about the same there. One thing I will caution you on is I've had people talk about, wow, God, this tar spot's coming in so late. Let's go at R3 or maybe even R2. Unfortunately, guys, in these particular trials, that was too late for getting on these fungicide applications. You can see that here in that second to last picture. Pretty significant tar spot pressure there, even on that R3 application. However, when we paired that VT with an R3 application, once again, it looked pretty decent. Honestly, guys, looking across all of these, if I had to pick, I would probably do a V10 followed by a VT. Okay. Now, with that, I've often got questions. Well, what about a VT followed by an R3? Yeah, that's okay. Honestly, though, guys, what I'm worried about is getting behind the 8-ball, especially if we started to see tar spot get in a little bit early. That V10 application followed by a VT, if you're doing 2 applications, probably going to provide more consistent results. Now, having said that, I will tell you this is out of our tar spot trial in 2022. We have it in 2023 as well. I have not seen that data yet. But in 2022, the R1 followed by the R3 looked very, very good. The R3, R4 looked pretty decent. But again, this one, it came in a little bit later. So not sure that that's going to be the best in every single year. That R1 followed by the R3 looked really good as well. R1 to R2 looked decent. And then the V10 to R3 looked decent as well. If you look at all of these, they're separated by about 3 bushels. And so really, I don't know if there's a huge advantage of one over the other for timing versus, if I'm going 2 applications, one at V10 versus R1 or one at R1 followed by R3. What I can tell you is that it's just really important that we manage our tar spot pressure, because if you look at that compared to our untreated check, it was about 10 bushels in this particular year. Now, we haven't had significant tar spot pressure yet to be able to really test this out. I'm hoping, I'm really crossing my fingers and hoping that in the next year that we get a really good tar spot year. And I know that farmers don't necessarily like to hear that, but man, I'd love to get some really good tar spot this next year. It's just an interesting disease to study, and I really want to show some good differences out in the answer plots. I know some of you guys probably don't like that approach too much, but it really could use some good data on that. So final things I'll leave you with. This is 2022 corn fungicide efficacy chart. We do have the 2023 version in the answer or in the crop protection guide as well. But this just give you an idea of where each one of these fits, both on corn and soybeans.